Okay, so let's talk about the Insta360 X5. Now, it'll come as no surprise that the X5 is a successor to last year's X4 model, but it offers some significant new features, ones that make a 360 camera much more practical for somebody like me. First and foremost are the brand new replaceable lenses. Now, I can't emphasize enough how important this is. One of the things that has held me back from using 360 cameras more is the vulnerability of the lens, and the fact that if you do scratch them, you get all sorts of horrible effects from the glare. It shows up quite noticeably. So having to send the camera off to have them replaced by the company itself is expensive, and it's also a massive inconvenience, and it stops me placing the camera in situations where the lenses might be at risk. So with the X5, the lenses are now user replaceable. You just buy a kit and it comes with all the tools necessary to be able to unscrew the existing lenses and replace them. You have to be careful about the humidity of the environment in which you replace them, so you don't end up with the moisture inside the lens and it fogging up. But now it means that we can put the camera in much more vulnerable situations and not have to worry about having to send the camera off for lens replacement if they get damaged. This means that I can now use a 360 camera much more of a POV on helmets and in other scenarios where there's a risk of those lenses getting knocked or bashed about. Not only that, but Insta360 reckons that the new lenses are far tougher and much more scratch resistant in the first place compared with the X4 and other previous models. In fact, if it wasn't for the other features on this camera, that would be reason enough for me personally to change over from the X4 to the X5. But there is even more to this camera. It has a 1/2.8 inch sensor, which means it's a much larger sensor. It's about 40% larger than the X4, which in turn should mean much better low light performance, much lower noise. We'll come to that in a bit. It still tops out at 8K resolution, which makes it good for reframing, particularly if you're going to output at 1080p. But the new sensor means that the results you get from reframing are better in quality than you get with the X4. Now, the X5 has 3 chips inside it. These are the famed AI chips that you find in the Ace Pro 2. And this means that the X5 is much better equipped to process those 360 images, particularly in low light, and perform much better color reproduction and such like. Now, you would have thought this might come at the expense of battery life, but in fact, the battery life on the X5 has been improved from the X4. But one thing that you still need to be aware of is that when you put the camera into 8K modes or the 5.7K plus modes, you are still going to be prone to overheating. Those modes take a lot more processing than the 5.7K mode. Now, the high dynamic range processing isn't available on 8K and 5.7K plus modes, but it is available on 5.7K. Now, one of the modes that I have found really useful on the X5 is called InstaFrame. And what this does is it simultaneously records a 360 image alongside a flat 1080p image. So if you're doing POV shots or selfie shots, you end up with an MP4, which is a flat frame. You don't have to reframe it, alongside a 360 version of the same video. I find this mode absolutely fantastic because it means POV shots that I get on the kayak, I can do that and I can get quick results from it, but I also have that 360 image ready for creative reframing or whatever else I want to do in the edit. Now, this maxes out at 5.7K for the 360 image, although you can use a 5.7K plus mode with it as well. Something that is really neat is that when you go into selfie mode with InstaFrame, the flat image will actually track you. So within the 360 image, it will give you that flat 1080p frame, but it will track you as you move along. And again, this is absolutely brilliant for doing selfie shots on a selfie pole, and then also having that separate 360 image saved for you for flexibility later. Now, something you will find with the X5 is that it performs much better in low light than the X4. Those extra image processors and perhaps a combination of those with the larger sensor mean that low light performance is much improved over the previous camera. Okay, so let's just take you away from the seaside for a moment and let's talk about the image quality of the X5 compared with the X4 a little bit more. So here we have a clip from the X4. It was taken just after sunset. It was getting pretty dark at this point. This is an 8K piece of footage. And as you can see already, you can see the noise in the clip. If I play it through, you can see how noisy it is here down on the darker areas on the beach. And, that's pretty apparent. Now, what's interesting is that when you export this footage, I have an export of this footage here. This is the same one. You'll notice that actually it's nowhere near as noisy. The software must do some sort of cleanup on the image when it upscales to 4K on the export, but you can still see down on this beach area, it's still pretty noisy. So yeah, that's the X4. Now let's take a look at the X5. Now, as you can see already, the image is far cleaner. It's a much cleaner image, and that is due to the better processors. It has the 3 image processors, but also the larger sensor as well. And when we look at this particular footage, you can see just how much cleaner it is after it's exported as well. You can see the subtlety of the color shading here as well. Both cameras were set to exactly the same settings. So this is a direct comparison in the same environment. But generally, this is a test to see how the noise levels compare in low light. Now, normally you wouldn't use 8K mode in low light. Insta360 recommends using the 5.7K mode. That's not the 5.7K plus mode, but the 5.7K mode for low light. But actually, I found that even in these light levels, the 8K mode on the X5 does work out really nicely. Now, here we have an example of some footage taken with the PureVideo mode. Now, this is designed for ultra low light scenarios. It produces a good result given the low light levels, although it doesn't seem to respond to the sharpness settings that you set the camera to. So I have my camera set to a low sharpness setting. And for me, this gives a really nice, creamy, smooth result out of the camera. But as you can see here, it's quite over sharpened. If you like that look, that's fine. But for me, the PureVideo mode looks a bit over sharp for my liking. Now, going back to that shot in the bay, I also have a PureVideo version of that as well. And yes, it produces a very clean image. But again, for me, it's a bit over sharpened. I prefer to do my sharpening in post. But, if you're in an ultra low light scenario, this mode does seem to perform very well indeed, and is certainly a step up from previous 360 cameras, particularly those in Insta360's range. And for me, it reproduces subtle tones much better than the X4. It also has a much higher dynamic range. We can see here, this is a 5.7K recording on the X5, and it's got the HDR processing turned on, and yes, it looks really nice. I mean, look at the subtlety of this sunset. It just looks great. It's got some really nice color reproduction as far as I can tell. And even in the 8K mode, this is the same shot in 8K. And yeah, it produces a really nice result. Now, if we compare that to the X4, this is the X4 with HDR processing on, and as you can see, it's not particularly good compared with the X5. Look at how this sunset really, it's very harsh, the way the colours are handled, the subtlety is gone. So yes, as far as I can tell in my tests so far, the X5 produces a noticeably better result and as far as dynamic range is concerned, as far as tonal reproduction goes, and in low light, it is definitely a much better performer. I just wish that Insta360 would put a 10-bit color mode on there. For audio, there's also a built-in audio filter, much like you'll find with the Ace Pro 2. Again, this makes recording without a separate microphone much more convenient if you're in blustery conditions. It still doesn't filter out all of the wind. Nothing's ever going to be completely perfect, but it's a good feature to have on this type of camera for when you need it. So this is a test of the audio at close range. I'm using the InstaFrame mode. So I'm using selfie view, and the wind protected microphone is actually on the other side of the camera. So it'll be interesting to see how it picks up. There are other microphones on this camera. So yeah, we'll see how that works out. So this is close range. Okay, so this is to see how well it picks up the audio at 3 meters. It'll be interesting to see if it picks up anything at all. I'm on the end of a 3 meter long selfie pole. As the fact that I said 3 meters might allude to. So let's see how that picks things up. Other tweaks from the X4 include the fact that the base of the camera now works with the Ace Pro 2 style magnetic clip mounts. Again, that's a feature of convenience. Although for me, because I often use these cameras in POV scenarios, I don't really like the vertical format of 360 cameras in general. So I have a frame that I bought from Insta360, which I screw onto the camera, and that allows me to mount the camera in a horizontal orientation. And on a helmet, although it's much more bulky than something like a GoPro or the Ace Pro 2, weight-wise, I'm not really noticing it so much. So it makes me look a bit silly, but it still works quite well as a helmet POV style of camera, because previous 360 cameras haven't quite got the quality that I like or the robustness. I haven't really been able to experiment with that much in the past. So with the X5, I find myself much more able to experiment with that type of shot. And that goes for mounting the camera on the front of the boat as well, where it's likely to get whacked by a paddle. It's much more low profile on the boat hull when I can mount it horizontally rather than in that vertical orientation. Waterproofing on the X5 has been massively improved from the X4. It now goes down to 15 meters. So that, of course, means that you can go deeper without the need for a dive case, although it's probably recommended that you do use a dive case if you are going into those sorts of situations. Insta360 makes an invisible dive case, so you can't see it. I think that's probably the safer bet if you are going into that type of environment. This should also mean that it's much more resistant to high impact water scenarios, such as when you're out in the surf. Now, Insta360 has also added the iLog picture profile to the camera. This only works in the standard 5.7K mode. It doesn't work in 5.7K plus or the 8K modes. Now, this does give you more flexibility for grading, but as per the Ace Pro 2, you're dealing with 8-bit color space. So this is something across the board, I think, that needs improving with the Insta360 cameras. The company says that a lot of the users that use its cameras are probably not going in depth into grading. But I think that giving people the option is the way to go. If you're going to put log on a camera, it really needs 10 bits, because if you're going to be using log, you're going to be the type of person who grades. And if you're going to be the type of person who grades, you're going to be the kind of person who wants and needs 10-bit color for that flexibility to be able to push things or to be able to mix the footage from this camera or cameras like the Ace Pro with larger cinema cameras. You know, you're going to be putting these cameras to uses where you can't really use another type of camera, or another type of camera doesn't give you the results you want. So having that option of 10-bit color would be the way to go. And to Insta360, I would really give serious consideration to doing this on a future model. But in general, the picture quality from this I really like. I do think it might be a bit noisy in the blue spectrum, but I need to investigate that a little bit more. But it looks smooth. I turn the sharpness right down to minimum, to the low setting, and I find that for me that gives the most pleasing results because I can sharpen things up later in post. The footage up converts very nicely, so in the InstaFrame mode, when I have that 1080p flat frame, it up converts using software like Topaz or the built-in abilities of Resolve. It up converts to 4K very nicely indeed. Now the X5 also has the ability to auto recognize interesting parts of your scene within the camera and highlight them so that when you come to use the app later on, it's easier to find footage. I've never really found any of these sorts of features work very well for me. When I'm kayaking or doing any kind of thing involving action, I never find that the camera properly identifies anything particularly interesting, and in fact quite often gives me the dullest moments. But maybe it works better for other vlogging scenarios or more spectacular shots, but for me it doesn't really work all that well. The other beneficial aspect of having these tougher lenses on the camera, as well as being user replaceable, is that you no longer have to rely on lens guards. Lens guards were the bane of my life with the previous camera. It produced horrible lens flare, and it was just no good for water scenarios because they're not water sealed. So again, that is another big advantage to having these user replaceable, much tougher lenses on this camera. So in all, does the X5 offer enough for you to upgrade over the X4 or other previous cameras? Certainly if you're on the X3 or X2, the X5, if you use 360 cameras a lot, is, I think, a very worthwhile upgrade. I think even over the X4, there is an appreciable difference in the image quality thanks to the larger sensor or sensors and that better processing. But for me, as I alluded to at the beginning of the video, the fact that you can replace these lenses out in the field and they're much tougher in the first place means that you can use this camera in much more vulnerable situations than you could with the previous cameras without worry. And that's the thing, it's about worry. Yes, changing the lenses is still going to be a little bit of a hassle, but it takes the worry out of it. You don't have to be concerned about sending this thing off to be repaired. So you're much likely to be able to take a bit more risk with it. And taking more risk means that you will probably get much more creative shots with this camera as a direct result of this feature. The InstaFrame mode, again, I'm reiterating what I just said, but for me, this is a highly useful feature. Again, it's a convenience feature for me that works really well. You know, you've got that flat image. If you just want to quickly put something out to social media, and then you've got the rest for creative editing later. I find InstaFrame to be my go-to mode on this camera, unless I really want to bump up the quality to 8K in an environment like this, where I'm not too worried about getting a selfie shot or getting a POV from my kayak. Now, something I have found is that occasionally the lens on the X5 can fog up. It depends on the situation, you know, the ambient air temperature versus where you've been keeping the camera and whether the camera heats up while it's in use compared with the ambient temperature. That can cause a little bit of fogging in the center. The whole thing hasn't fogged up, but just the center portion. And I've just had to let things acclimatize until that's disappeared. And that can take a little bit of time. This is one of the reasons why Insta360 says when you replace the lens yourself, you need to be careful about the humidity level of the environment in which you're replacing it. Now, this is probably one of the drawbacks of having a user replaceable lens, but for me, the convenience of knowing that I can replace the lens myself kind of trumps that of the risk of condensation forming. Condensation's a little bit of an inconvenience, but you can deal with it. There are ways and means by which you can, you know, get that sorted out. But it's just something to be aware of compared with some of the other cameras, which I haven't had this issue on. 360 cameras for me have always been a little bit of a Marmite thing. If you're not in the UK, Marmite's something you either love or hate. I love 360 cameras for their versatility. but I don't tend to use them too much, and that's purely because of vulnerability reasons. And this changes everything for me. So this makes a 360 camera much more practical and much less worrisome. So the fact that I don't have to worry as much with the X5 in terms of damaging the lenses is a big reason why I would consider this camera over every other option out there.